The wheels shrieked against iron rails somewhere in the darkness ahead, and a woman. To understand what a journey like this truly felt like, you have to first understand what America looked like in the years just after the Civil War, when the rails first stretched their iron arms from ocean to ocean. Only 6 years earlier, in May of 1869, a golden spike had been driven into a tie at Promontory Summit, Utah, joining the Central Pacific and Union Pacific lines and, for the first time in human history, making it possible to cross an entire continent without ever stepping off a train. Before that moment, a trip from New York to San Francisco could take 4 to 6 months by wagon, or many perilous weeks by ship around the tip of South America. By 1875, that same journey could be completed in under 7 days. It was, to the people living through it, nothing short of a miracle. Newspapers of the era described the Transcontinental Railroad as the eighth wonder of the world, and for a generation raised on stories of the Oregon Trail and the Donner Party, perhaps it was. But a miracle, in 1875, was still a deeply uncomfortable, often dangerous, and thoroughly exhausting experience. To board a train in that era was to step into a world governed by class, money, patience, and no small amount of luck. Picture, for a moment, a depot in a mid-sized American city, say Omaha or Kansas City, on an ordinary morning in the autumn of 1875. The station itself was likely a wooden structure, perhaps brick if the town had prospered, with a platform crowded with humanity in a way that would astonish a modern traveler. Farmers in rough canvas coats stood beside bankers in silk top hats. Immigrant families, often Irish, German, Scandinavian, or Chinese, clutched trunks and bundles containing everything they owned in the world. Soldiers still wore remnants of Union blue, 5 years after Appomattox, because a uniform coat was simply a coat, and coats were expensive. Children ran between legs and luggage while vendors hawked apples, meat pies, and newspapers through the din of hissing steam and clanging bells. The trains themselves were marvels of Victorian engineering, though by today's standards they would seem almost quaint. A typical passenger locomotive of 1875 was a wood or coal-burning steam engine, its firebox tended constantly by a fireman who shoveled fuel by hand into flames that could reach temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The engineer sat in an open or semi-enclosed cab, exposed to wind, rain, snow, and flying cinders, watching the track ahead with an intensity that never relaxed, because there were no automatic signals, no radios, and often no reliable way to know if another train occupied the same stretch of single track just around the next bend. This was, in fact, one of the great hidden terrors of train travel in 1875. Most rail lines outside the busiest eastern corridors were single-track affairs, meaning trains traveling in opposite directions shared the same rails and depended entirely on precise timetables, telegraph communication, and the discipline of station agents to avoid catastrophic head-on collisions. When a telegraph wire went down in a storm, or a watch ran a few minutes slow, or a dispatcher made a simple clerical error, the result could be sudden and devastating. Train wrecks were a genuine and widely feared possibility, reported with grim regularity in the newspapers of the day. Passengers who boarded a train in 1875 understood, in a way modern travelers rarely do, that they were placing their lives in the hands of fallible men and imperfect machines. Once aboard, the experience of the journey itself depended enormously on how much money a passenger carried. Rail travel in this era was rigidly divided by class, and nowhere was this more visible than in the difference between first class and what was commonly called emigrant class. For those who could afford it, first-class travel in 1875 offered a genuine taste of luxury, largely thanks to the innovations of one man whose name became synonymous with comfort on rails, George Pullman. Pullman had begun building his famous sleeping cars in the 1860s, and by 1875 his palace cars represented the absolute height of American travel elegance. Picture rich walnut paneling, hand-carved moldings, brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine, and upholstered seats covered in velvet or fine leather. By day, these seats faced one another in comfortable compartments. By night, porters, almost always African-American men employed by the Pullman Company in a labor arrangement that would shape black economic life in America for the next century, would transform those same seats into berths, pulling down hidden upper bunks and folding lower seats into beds, all while passengers dined or socialized in adjoining cars. A first-class Pullman passenger in 1875 might enjoy a dining car serving multi-course meals, complete with white tablecloths, china plates, and silver cutlery, all prepared in a narrow galley kitchen that somehow produced roasted meats, fresh bread, and even ice cream, despite the constant swaying and jolting of the train. Some luxury trains carried their own small libraries, smoking lounges for gentlemen, and even primitive bathing facilities. For a wealthy businessman or a fashionable family making the journey west, a transcontinental trip could feel almost like staying in a fine hotel that happened to move at 30 miles per hour through some of the most dramatic scenery on the continent. But this luxury came at a steep price, one that placed it entirely out of reach for the vast majority of Americans. A first-class ticket combined with Pullman sleeping car fare from Omaha to San Francisco could cost well over $100, an enormous sum at a time when many laborers earned less than $2 a day. For the millions of ordinary Americans and immigrants heading west in search of land, work, or a new beginning, the experience of train travel looked entirely different. Emigrant cars, as they were called, were the polar opposite of Pullman luxury. These were often simple wooden coaches with hard bench seats, sometimes nothing more than slatted wood without cushioning of any kind. There was no heat beyond a single wood or coal stove at one end of the car, which meant passengers near the stove often roasted while those at the far end shivered through long winter nights. There was no dining car for these travelers. Instead, families packed their own food for journeys that could stretch 5, 6, even 7 days, subsisting on hard bread, dried meat, cheese, and whatever they could purchase during brief stops at trackside towns, where local vendors would rush the platform selling coffee, pie, and sandwiches through open windows before the conductor's whistle signaled departure. Sanitation on these emigrant cars, and indeed on most trains of the era regardless of class, was primitive by any modern standard. Toilet facilities, where they existed at all, were simple holes that emptied directly onto the tracks below, meaning passengers were instructed never to use them while the train was stopped in a station. Water for drinking and washing came from a single tank at the end of the car, refilled at stops, and often shared by dozens of passengers using a single tin cup chained to the tank, a detail that horrifies modern sensibilities but was simply accepted as the reality of the age. The physical experience of riding these trains was, by any modern measure, exhausting and often painful. The rails of 1875 were far from the smooth, continuously welded steel tracks of today. Individual iron or early steel rails were bolted together in shorter sections, creating a constant rhythmic clack and jolt as the wheels passed over each joint, a sound and sensation that never stopped for the entire duration of a journey. Cars lacked the sophisticated suspension systems of later eras, meaning every irregularity in the track transmitted directly through the floor and into the bones of seated passengers. Sleep, for those without a Pullman berth, meant attempting to doze upright, head lolling against a window or a stranger's shoulder, jolted awake repeatedly through the night. Temperature control was virtually non-existent by modern standards. In summer, windows were thrown open for relief from the heat, which meant enduring clouds of coal smoke, hot cinders that could burn clothing or skin, and choking dust kicked up from dry western plains. In winter, closed windows meant stale air thick with the smoke of pipes, cigars, and the ever-present wood or coal stoves, combined with the mingled odors of unwashed bodies packed closely together for days on end. Ventilation was poor, and outbreaks of illness aboard crowded emigrant cars were not uncommon, spreading easily among passengers confined together in close quarters for the better part of a week. Yet for all this discomfort, the journey offered something that no American had ever experienced before in human history, the ability to witness, within a single unbroken week, the staggering diversity of an entire continent unfolding outside a window. A passenger departing Omaha in 1875 would first cross the seemingly endless grasslands of Nebraska, an ocean of prairie grass stretching to every horizon, interrupted only by occasional homestead cabins, grazing cattle, and the startling sight of massive bison herds, still numbering in the millions in certain regions, though already beginning the catastrophic decline that would nearly drive the species to extinction within another decade. As the train pushed westward into Wyoming, the landscape began its dramatic transformation. Rolling plains gave way to increasingly rugged terrain, and passengers caught their first glimpses of the Rocky Mountains rising blue and jagged on the horizon, a sight that reportedly left many Easterners speechless, having never before seen mountains of such scale. The train climbed steadily through Sherman Summit in Wyoming, reaching elevations over 8,000 feet, the highest point on the entire Transcontinental route, where thin mountain air and dramatic rock formations reminded passengers just how far they had traveled from the humid lowlands of the east. Beyond the Rockies lay a landscape many passengers found almost otherworldly, the high desert plateaus of Wyoming and Utah, where sagebrush stretched to the horizon under an enormous sky, and strange rock formations carved by wind and ancient water told a geological story stretching back millions of years, though few passengers in 1875 would have understood the science behind what they were seeing. The train would pass near the shores of the Great Salt Lake, its waters so dense with minerals that objects floated with unusual buoyancy, a curiosity many travelers noted with amazement in letters home. Then came the Sierra Nevada, the final great obstacle before California, and here the engineering achievement of the Transcontinental Railroad became most vividly apparent. Chinese immigrant laborers, numbering in the tens of thousands, had carved this route through solid granite mountains just years earlier, working with hand tools and black powder explosives under brutal conditions, often suspended in baskets over sheer cliff faces to drill blasting holes, enduring winters so severe that entire work camps were sometimes buried in avalanches. Passengers riding through the Sierra Nevada in 1875 passed through miles of wooden snow sheds, structures built to protect the tracks from the massive snowfalls that could otherwise bury the line entirely, remnants of an engineering battle against nature that had cost an untold number of lives, most of them Chinese workers whose names were rarely recorded and whose contributions were, for generations afterward, largely erased from the popular memory of how the railroad had been built. Finally, descending from the mountains into California's Central Valley, passengers would witness a landscape utterly transformed once more, fertile agricultural land, orchards, and eventually the fog-touched hills leading towards San Francisco Bay, a final destination that, only a decade earlier, would have represented the end of a journey lasting the better part of a year by wagon train, filled with genuine danger from disease, starvation, hostile encounters, and the unforgiving terrain itself. This transformation in travel time carried consequences that rippled through nearly every aspect of American life. Mail that once took weeks or months to cross the continent could now arrive in days. Perishable goods, fresh fruit from California, could reach eastern markets while still edible. News of events on one coast could reach the other in a fraction of the time it once required, accelerating the pace of American commerce, journalism, and even courtship, as couples separated by thousands of miles could now realistically plan to reunite in a matter of days rather than months. The railroad also profoundly reshaped the American West itself, and not always for the better. Towns sprang up seemingly overnight wherever rail lines were built, often centered entirely around a depot, while towns bypassed by the railroad frequently withered and died, their populations relocating to wherever the trains now stopped. Native American nations, whose ancestral lands the railroad cut directly through, watched as the buffalo herd central to their way of life were decimated, partly by hunters who shot the animals from train windows for sport, leaving carcasses to rot on the prairie while trophy hunters bragged of their kill counts. The railroad, celebrated in Eastern newspapers as a triumph of progress and civilization, represented for many native peoples a final and irreversible transformation of their homeland, arriving alongside broken treaties, forced relocations, and a rapidly diminishing way of life that had existed on the plains for countless generations. Meanwhile, aboard the trains themselves, danger remained a constant companion regardless of class or comfort. Beyond the ever-present risk of collision or derailment, passengers in certain regions faced the genuine possibility of robbery. Train robbery, though perhaps less common than popular Western films would later suggest, was nonetheless a real and feared occurrence in 1875, with armed bandits occasionally boarding trains or blocking tracks to rob passengers and raid mail cars carrying cash and valuables. Railroad companies responded by hiring armed guards for certain routes, and passengers, particularly those carrying significant sums for business ventures out west, sometimes traveled armed themselves, a reminder that the romantic image of westward expansion coexisted uneasily with genuine and constant risk. Weather posed its own relentless threat. Blizzards in the mountain passes could strand trains for days, leaving passengers to ration dwindling food supplies while rescue crews worked desperately to clear snow-choked tracks. Summer thunderstorms could wash out bridges or trigger dangerous flash floods across the very rail beds trains depended upon. Passengers of 1875 accepted these delays and dangers as simply part of the bargain, an inherent risk in exchange for the extraordinary privilege of crossing an entire continent within a single week. Despite all of this, the accounts left behind by passengers who made this journey in 1875 reveal something remarkable, a persistent sense of wonder that outweighed the discomfort and danger. Letters and diaries from the period describe travelers pressing their faces against grimy windows for hours, unwilling to look away from landscapes unlike anything they had known, watching sunrise paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and rose, or standing at open car platforms despite railroad company warnings, feeling wind and cinders against their faces simply to experience, fully and directly, the sensation of crossing a continent that had, only a few years earlier, seemed impossibly vast. For immigrants arriving from Europe or Asia, the journey held particular significance, often representing the final leg of an already extraordinary migration that had carried them across oceans and now across an entire continent toward land, opportunity, or family members who had gone west before them. For veterans of the Civil War, the journey offered a chance to see, firsthand, the scale and diversity of the nation they had fought to preserve, a physical reminder that America was far larger and stranger and more beautiful than any single battlefield could suggest. For countless ordinary families, the journey represented simply the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, hard labor, and the particular blend of hope and anxiety that has always characterized the American pursuit of a better life. By the time a train finally pulled into its destination, whether San Francisco, Sacramento, or one of the countless smaller towns scattered along the route, passengers emerged into the world profoundly changed by their journey, not merely in location but in perspective. They had witnessed, in the span of a single week, the transition from humid eastern forests to endless prairie grassland, from towering mountain peaks to arid desert plateau, from ancient granite tunnels carved by immigrant labor to the fertile valleys and fog-draped hills of the Pacific coast. They had endured discomfort, danger, exhaustion, and uncertainty, and in doing so had participated in one of the great technological and human achievements of the 19th century. The world these travelers stepped into upon arrival was itself being reshaped by the very trains that carried them, as the railroad accelerated the settlement of the American West at a pace that would have seemed impossible mere decades earlier, bringing with it both tremendous opportunity and profound, often tragic consequences for the peoples and landscapes it touched. The rails that clacked beneath weary passengers in 1875 were not merely carrying people from one coast to another. They were carrying an entire nation into a new era, one defined by speed, connection, and an ever-shrinking sense of distance, even as that same speed and connection came at genuine human cost, both to the immigrant laborers who had built the tracks and to the native peoples whose homeland those tracks now crossed. Today, the descendants of those iron rails still stretch across much of the same terrain, though the wooden coaches and hissing steam engines of 1875 have long since given way to diesel and electric power, climate-controlled cars, and journeys measured in mere hours rather than exhausting days. Yet something of that original wonder remains accessible to any modern traveler willing to seek it out, whether aboard a scenic Amtrak route through the Rockies or simply standing at an old depot, now perhaps a museum, imagining the crowd of travelers who once gathered there, clutching tickets and trunks, waiting for the whistle that would carry them into the vast and uncertain promise of the American West. Their journey, uncomfortable and dangerous as it often was, remains a testament to human ambition, endurance, and the enduring desire to see what lies beyond the horizon, one iron mile at a time.